Okay, welcome everybody to the Salon on Women Writers, Immigration and Counter-Revolutionary Feminism. It's lovely to see you, and it's early here in New Zealand, so we'll just pretend that you're waking up in New Zealand and starting the conference here. It's my real pleasure to do this Salon, which began as a set of papers prepared for the Cahiers de la Révolution Française, and the panelists thought that they might make a nice salon for the conference. So just so that you can see can we see the panelists? If the panelists would just do their videos so everybody can see them, that would be great. If I just go from the right, we've got Christine Adams from St Mary's College in Maryland. We've got Stacey Allen, who's an independent. We have got Philip Mansel, who's from the Society of Court Studies, also independent. We've got Christy Margrave from ANU. We're in Marie-Emmanuelle from Paris-Créteil, Kate Astbury from the University of Warwick, and of course me from Massey. So these papers all look at the link between immigration and the French Revolution and these writers of the early Romantic period, women at a crossroads of history and literature. The members of this panel all specialise in one key woman who was involved either by being directly affected by immigration and reflecting that in her own literature, or indirectly through corresponding and other activities that helped the emigres to escape and survive the revolution. These women helped friends and relatives, often out of compassion for the mental health of the women involved, as a sort of spontaneous collective solidarity. And mental health and issues are all around us with COVID-19, but it's important to realise that notions of maintaining well-being were deeply embedded in the actions of the emigres in revolutionary society. And for these women, it was their home life that was disrupted and displaced, whether that was into exile and a forced removal from Paris to the provinces. And provincial displacement, of course, did not attract the full force of the emigre laws, quite as it does to those who crossed the border. But that was often untenable, as we saw with Colin Jones and the Duchesse d'Elbeuf. Emigres risked danger in order to escape, and these intensely personal experiences and actions ended up in their novels. And in other novels, all the way through the 19th century, right through as far as Les Dieux dans Soif, Anatole France's novel. So what is central to this panel on women writers is the fact that they draw attention to where the personal and the political intersect, the family and the state, the religious and the secular. And they do it at the time of the revolution using the method of narration. And in this process, showing that the young genre of the novel can be a mechanism for writing truth quasi-impartially about a complex period of history. So with the tropes and the rules of the sentimental novel still evolving, it was possible to write about emotions or the emotive reactions both of revolutionaries and of the emigres, and to infuse deeper threads of social criticism that targeted the emotional fabric or the lifeblood of French society with a demand for reform. This literature also reminds us that living an event and recording it is a matter of negotiating the feelings and trauma, coming to terms with the ruptures within the collective, and as a way of healing. It's difficult to be readers and writers at the same time. Immigration has sometimes been considered narrow, and yet it's one avenue of study that shows how blurred the lines are between revolution and the counter-revolution. This was a whole society in turmoil beneath the surface, a reality much closer to our own 20th and 21st century upheavals. We know that the audience for all these writers was not just women and not just emigres, but the men as well, who came from across the political spectrum and the social spectrum. These were well-educated, cosmopolitan, multilingual men who were well-informed about how others lived outside France. And talking about being multilingual and cosmopolitan, I can't think of a better way to introduce our first speaker, Philip Mansel, whose book there you can see on the screen in the middle. It is on Louis XIV, King of the World, and he is going to talk about Madame de Staël and how she links the immigration with the home front in Paris and with the emigres on the outside. Now, Philip has, of course, written a raft of books that concerned immigration, from Louis XVIII to particularly Paris Between Empires, looks at all the ramifications of this later period. But for now, he's going to be talking about Madame de Staël and her rather complex character. But just remember as we start to talk, this was the Madame de Staël who wrote éclairer, instruire, perfectionner les femmes comme les hommes, les nations comme les individus, c'est encore le meilleur secret pour tous les buts raisonnables, pour toutes les relations sociales et politiques auxquelles on veut assurer un fondement durable. Philip.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. Very happy to be here with you. And Madame de Staël was a great writer, as Kirsty has reminded us. Her words come off the page even now. And she's fully engaged with the issues of the revolution, the counter-revolution, feminism, and emigration. Her name comes from the fact she married the Swedish ambassador to France. She can move around Europe really fairly easily. She spoke German. She's of partly Swiss origin. Passionately revolutionary, she then leaves in 1792 because she's Swedish in theory. She's not actually technically an émigré. She spends most of the 1790s outside France. She writes A Defense of the Queen, 1793, and she sees her as a mother and great emphasizes her love for her children and her husband. Then in her novels, Delphine and Corinne, émigrés are presented fairly sympathetically as people of honor who've lost their fortunes often. And then in the period where she really comes to life as a major, she was always called a great power like Great Britain and Russia, after 1812, she's in contact with the émigré government of Louis XVIII in England. She makes the first move. She's promised rewards because her father had lent money to Louis XVI, and she starts writing and speaking in favor of the Bourbons. And for example, in Considération sur la Révolution Française, which is published in 1818, she calls the Charter, the Constitution of Louis XVIII, the palladium of the monarchy and the fatherland. And she sees Louis XVIII, he gives her some money, and she's always a mother. She's really pressing her son's careers, and the dowry that Louis XVIII has given her allows her to marry her daughter to the Duc de Broglie, founding a great dynasty of French writers and politicians, mainly liberal monarchists. She's presented at court, and then in 1817, Madame de Staël dies. But I think she shows how blurred the frontiers were. She had émigré publishers, even though she herself had supported the revolution. And she's perfectly happy to deal with the Tsar of Russia or the Crown Prince of Sweden or the Prince Regent of England when they're fighting France. It's really quite interesting how protean or flexible she is in her attitudes. She says, oh, I'm a French woman, I don't want to see the Cossacks in the Champs-Élysées, but in fact she uses them to get back to France. And I would say she shows that in reality, people weren't as opposed or hostile to the emigration as sometimes they pretended to be, and nor indeed opposed to the monarchy if it suited their personal strategies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip. I'm going to introduce our next speaker now, Dr. Christy Margrave. Christy is a lecturer in French studies at ANU, Australian National University. Before moving to Australia, she was a lecturer in French at Aberystwyth in Wales and a lecturer in French and Translation Studies at Cardiff University before that. Her first book was based on her thesis, which I had the great pleasure of examining. It's just been published by Legenda. You should be able to see the picture of it here in a moment. There we go, perfect timing. So, Writing the Landscape, Exposing Nature in French Women's Fiction, 1789 to 1815, published in 2019, as I say, by Legenda. Fascinating study of women novelists of the period and their portrayal of the natural landscape. Her current project develops this further and probes eco-critical awareness in 18th and early 19th century French literature. Christy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you very much, Kirsty, for your introduction as well. So today I'm going to be talking about Sophie Cottin. The celebrated 19th century literary critic Sainte-Beuve underlines the popularity of women writers of late 18th and early 19th century France, including most of the women that we're talking about on this panel. However, amongst modern scholarship, Sophie Cottin in particular has been largely forgotten. And that's a significant oversight, really, because as Sainte-Beuve himself states, rien n'égale le succès qu'eurent dans leur temps le roman de Madame Cottin. So her first and her last novels, Claire d'Albe and Elisabeth, in fact topped the country's list of bestsellers, and all of her novels were published in multiple languages throughout Europe. So she really does deserve to be remembered. As well as marking the start of the revolutionary decade, 1789 was also the year Sophie married her wealthy Parisian banker husband, Paul Cottin, and the family's wealth put them in a dangerous position during the Terror, and Paul and Sophie fled France for England via Spain in 1792. Although her family remained in England until 1800, Sophie and Paul didn't remain there very long and returned to Paris in 1793. Her husband died later that same year, and she found a great part of her fortune confiscated. Her name remained on the list of émigrés until 1798, when she campaigned to have it removed. In order to do so, she had to prove that she'd not left France since the 1st of January 1792, and clearly that involved quite a significant lie and covering up of the period she spent in Spain and England, but nonetheless her attempt was successful. Writing the first two of her novels then during the revolutionary decade, she wrote in the preface to Claire d'Albe of her desire to escape what she calls le labyrinthe du monde, and the chaos of the revolution and the terror. However, as she flees one socio-political nightmare, she focuses on another. She focuses on the preoccupations and difficulties encountered by women under a patriarchal system. Her books portray feisty women who disobey expectations, often cruel or inconstant or unfeeling male characters. And the female characters of her early novels all suffer traumatic events at the hands of the patriarchal system. Her later works, her novels Mathilde, Elisabeth, and her prose poem La Prise de Jéricho, confront both the patriarchy and indirectly the revolution itself. Whilst Mathilde and La Prise de Jéricho were published after the revolutionary decade, her correspondence actually reveals that she'd been working towards them much earlier. And the themes which recur throughout those works were clearly in her mind during the 1790s. It therefore becomes very interesting to read the novel's sometimes anti-revolutionary sentiment. She never addresses the revolution or her experience as an émigré directly in her novels, but her novels reveal her dealing indirectly with issues caused by socio-political upheaval, changes, and danger. All three of those later works exalt Christianity at a time when the revolutionaries had de-Christianized the state, and they also present aristocratic values in a particularly positive light. As with her earlier works, she escapes situations imposed by the revolution, in this case, de-Christianization and the condemning and execution of the nobility, and again finds herself confronting the patriarchal system. So the women of her later novels are frequently subjected to and often rebel against the will of male family members or powerful male figures. All of her works, with one exception, are set outside of France, and her choices for setting her tales often have particular relevance. So of particular relevance to our present discussion is the fact that Elisabeth and La Prise de Jéricho are both successful stories of successful return from exile. And they're written only a decade after her own return from England, and even closer to her family's return. And the success of the returns in the novel are both reliant upon the strong female protagonists who instigate or facilitate them, and not on the status or qualities of the powerful male characters. So it's the strength of women that she's showing that's able to initiate the happy return of those who've been forced to leave their country. a self-professed fan of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his opinions on women's social roles, she would not have called herself a feminist, even if the term had existed at the time. Nonetheless, she is a woman writer who discusses the oppression of her sex and partakes of particular themes and discourse in order to do so in a more compelling manner, all the while dealing with the changes brought about by the traumas of revolution and exile. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Christy. I didn't say before that we will move on around the panel and then come back for questions. So note down your questions as you're going through and we'll come back to do that. Sorry, I haven't started my video. There I am. The next speaker is Christine Adams. And I'd just like to say before we start with Christine that I'd like to say a very big thank you to Christine because she helped with the setup of the conference, and as we were going to do the program in Auckland, she was going to be very involved in it, and then of course it went online and didn't come to Auckland. So, but Christine Adams is, apart from being a lovely friend, is a Professor of History at St Mary College in Maryland, and her focus has always been on the family and gender history, right from her early book, A Taste for Comforts and Status, A Bourgeois Family in the 18th Century France. In 2015, she published Female Beauty Systems, Beauty as Social Capital in Western Europe and the United States, Middle Ages to the Present. And with Tracy, our co-president, she's just published this lovely book on the creation of the French royal mistresses from Agnès Sorel to Madame du Barry. If I can say my favorite is to this day of her writings, her article on Venus of the Capital in French Historical Studies. So if anybody hasn't read that article, please make sure you do. Here she's going to look at how Thérèse Tallien used her influence to help the émigrés. And she's going on with developing these projects. She's going to be a fellow at the American Council of Learned Societies in 2021 and an Andrew Mellon Fellow at the Newbury Library, which we hope she can do because of COVID, etc., etc. But Christine, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kirsty, and I'm so sorry not to be there live right now. Anyway, so my point of entry into this discussion is rather different from that of my colleagues here today. While I'm drawing on the well-known emigration memoirs of two royalist female writers, the Marquise de Lage de Beaulieu and the Marquise de La Tour de Pin, my focus is less on them and more on a young woman who helped both escape from France in early 1794. In the midst of the Reign of Terror, Thérèse de Fontenay, née Cabarrus, became an important node in the networks that facilitated the escape of aristocrats fleeing the country through the port city of Bordeaux. Her romantic relationship with Jean-Lambert Tallien, a member of the National Convention and future husband, gave her access to the coveted passports required to leave France, access that she used to help a number of individuals. For her efforts in Bordeaux, the daughter of Madame de Genlis, Christian Thérèse Notre-Dame de Bon Secours, later in the summer of 1794, she would also be credited with helping to bring the Reign of Terror to an end. For those mythic efforts, she was nicknamed Notre Dame of Thermidor. Among French historians, Thérèse Tallien is one of the best-known female names associated with the revolutionary years. The young and beautiful Spanish immigrant to France married into a noble family in the last years of the Ancien Regime and became involved in liberal political circles in the early phase of the revolution. She took advantage of the new divorce laws to rid herself of a less than satisfactory spouse turned émigré, and then used her romantic connection to Tallien to assist others trying to flee the country. Following Tallien back to Paris in April of 1794, she fell victim to Robespierre's Committee of Public Safety, was thrown into prison, and inspired her lover Tallien to lead the charge against Robespierre and his allies on the 9th of Thermidor. Thérèse then emerged as elegant merveilleuse and queen of the Directory under the next government, but eventually became persona non grata in elite French circles as Napoleon asserted control. While contemporaries and historians of the revolution have penned accounts of Thérèse's activities in Bordeaux, her motives are shrouded in the romantic myths that have shaped her biography more generally over the years. Was she a closet royalist eager to help fellow aristocrats flee the terror? Was she in fact a committed Republican, but good-hearted and touched by the stories of those trying to escape the guillotine? Or was she essentially an amoral and apolitical grifter, willing to traffic in passports through an informal bureau de grâce for terrified royalist would-be émigrés, a lucrative black market in the chaotic days of the terror? Historians have suggested all of the above. Her own description of her activities, both in Bordeaux and afterwards, represent a conscious effort to mythologize her role in challenging and ending the terror, Numerous contemporary accounts support her self-flattering image. The Marquise de Ligne, who was a companion to Marie Antoinette's close friend, the Princess de Lamballe, and a fierce royalist, and the Marquise de Dupin, who was the daughter of a noble family with Irish roots, penned two of the most compelling narratives of Theresia's good offices in Bordeaux as part of more comprehensive memoirs of emigration. These accounts helped contribute to Theresia's reputation both for good-heartedness and for venality. Subsequent generations of writers found them useful sources in constructing her posthumous image. The portraits the two marquises left of Theresia were significantly more thorough and complicated than those left by the men whom she helped to leave the country, and reflected the preoccupations of aristocratic women trying to protect themselves and their families. Despite the evaluative stance of these female, but not feminist memoirs, both of which drew on popular tropes about class and gender, we also get hints of complicated motives on Theresia's part that track with recent efforts to rethink her ambitions and self-image in ways that more accurately reflect her personal agency and a desire to carve out a political identity for herself. In their retrospective accounts, both marquises undoubtedly judged Theresia's behavior through the lens of the emerging cult of domesticity that many female aristocrats embraced in the wake of the revolution. And this is something that Margaret Darrow and others have talked about. You also see a strong sense of class identity in how they talk about her and her relationship with Talleyrand. Their accounts reflect feminine condemnation of Theresia's decision to link her fortunes to that of a man like Talleyrand, for both whom displayed aristocratic contempt, along with disapproval of Theresia's perceived ambitiousness. However, both L'Age de Voleude and La Tour du Pin also demonstrated appreciation for her assistance and some sympathy for a young woman who was both beautiful and appealing, if lacking in conventional morality. That said, both seem more shocked by her choice of lover rather than by the fact that she had one. I'm in the process of rethinking the part that Theresia played in these women's emigration narratives, and how by reading between the lines and contextualizing her activities, as well as by rethinking the narrative agendas of the two female memorialists, which are quite muddled in some ways, that we can reinscribe them in a way that reconsiders the conventional interpretations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine. I'm now going to introduce our next speaker, Kirsty Carpenter. Doesn't really need an introduction, but I'm going to give one anyway. Kirsty is Associate Professor of History at Massey University. She is a specialist on history of emigration and the émigrés, or refugees who left France during the Revolutionary Wars between 1789 and 1815, particularly those who went to Britain. She did a scholarly edition of the fictional memoirs of the Counter-Rev, Eugénie et Mathilde, by Madame de Souza, which was published by the MHRA in 2014. Before that, she published the novels of Madame de Souza in Social and Political Perspective in 2007. Her thesis was published as a monograph, Refugees of the French Revolution, Émigrés in London, 1789 to 1802. She also published a volume on the French émigrés in Europe and the struggle against revolution, 1789 to 1814, edited with Philip Mansel. Both were published by Palgrave in 1999. She has been active with scholars around the world interested in promoting emigration as a field of studies, and one that connects the literary and the historical worlds. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank her on behalf of all of the panelists for organising this salon and giving us an opportunity to share our ideas on these women.
Thank you, Kate. Oh, that's lovely. If you can also see how long Philip Mansel and I have been working on émigrés and trying to push émigrés to the fore as an interesting group of people. It's a pleasure to add Madame de Souza into this discussion. She was an eyewitness in Paris to the early years of the revolution, and she saw the way families reacted to events. That included, of course, the dissolution of the monastic orders, monasteries and convents. And so as the Comtesse de Flo, which was her name until 1802 when she married Souza, it was a literature of the revolution that she shared not only with other women writers, but the very action of the revolution itself, and particularly in this period when the pace of change started to accelerate. So she was born in 1761, her parents were dead by 67, and when she married in 79, her sister Julie, the Marquise of Marigny, was her only family. Now Julie was married to the brother of Madame de Pompadour, So from this period and through 1789 to 1792, the Comtesse de Fleu lived in the Old Louvre along the Rue Saint-Honoré, and she watched the revolution unfold from the most strategic vantage point. She very much lived the revolution à vif, and the emigration affected the rest of her life. So it was not really surprising that this echoed through her novels, both those that were about the revolution and those that weren't. And all of her novels had a revolution subtext of gender equality, democratic practices, advocating implicitly for more representative government, and rejecting arbitrary and authoritarian ways. Interestingly, she did not feel able to publish a novel about immigration until quite well into the new century, almost 20 years after her experience of it. So her first three novels are ones where the references to revolution are disguised, even if the rights arguments are plain. Emily and Alphonse in 1799 is about marriage and family. It's about the abuses of the old regime, about legal family authority being misused, rather than state politics per se. But there's an exile in the subtext plot of that novel. And then Charles and Marie in 1802, where she is an English story. So then there's a gap until Eugène de Rotelin in 1808, where you have the events of the campaign of Austerlitz to the campaigns, to the Spanish campaigns, and she experiences some side problems. So she was not a stranger to financial problems either. She lost her livelihood entirely in the revolution. Her first marriage, interestingly, had a marriage contract that allowed her some property, but of course it never came to fruition because he died guillotined and the property was confiscated anyway, anything that would have still been there to have. The survivor could take the property to the value of 8,000 livres, and this is quite unusual. So she had lived on pensions from the king that Monsieur de Fleu had, also from the Comte d'Artois, and the fact that his younger brother was the director of royal buildings had augmented their finances because he bolstered them. So when the revolution came, the real crunch point for Madame de Fleu was the 10th of August and the fact that her husband decided to rescue some of the King's Guard who were wounded, and of course that he was wanted, he was put on a list for arrest, and she went to Mehdi de la Touche, got passports for both of them to get out of Paris. He went to Boulogne and she went to London. So she, as an emigre, she experienced this anxiety and trauma. Remember that at this stage it was very unusual for women to travel alone. And these were the sorts of things that she found herself in London. She was luckier than some because Lord Wickham, who became later the second Marquis of Lansdowne, had taken a house for her in Half Moon Street. And it was there that she finished Adam de Saint-Ange, and with his sponsorship published it. She made a handsome profit from the subscription, and she had few expenses because while she was there, she dined, like many other French guests, with William Petty, the first Marquis of Lansdowne. And she went back to the continent after she had published Adele de Saint-Ange, from Switzerland through to Altona outside Hamburg, and she, among other adventures, helped Louis Philippe to get back from Switzerland to Hamburg and out to America. So she was resourceful and she financed herself. The interesting thing, and I've always thought this was interesting about her, was that she continued to do that after her second marriage to Sousa in 1802. Now, he was the Portuguese ambassador to France, a position he lost when the war retook in 1803. So in those years, she retired into sort of an intimacy of close family. After 1811, she gave herself over to educating her grandson, Auguste de Morny, who was the son of Charles and Hortense when she was Queen of Holland. And this just shows how much complexity was behind this canvas. That this was the beginnings and the central canvas, which from the first novel, Adele de Saint-Ange, to the last one, The Comtesse de Fargy, she infused into her novels. Her characters were drawn from her friends, from their experiences, from people that she knew intimately. Her second husband died in 1825, and she outlived him by 10 years, dying in 1836, in the Rue Saint-Honoré, where she'd started off, importantly. She was always Parisian, and one of the things she was most proud of was that her novels were French. Nobody could call her anti-French, as they did sometimes Madame de Staël. So it's rather fitting that she's buried in Père Lachaise. And there's a picture on the next slide, I think, Dave, of her grave in Père Lachaise as you go over. But she very much belongs in this fraternity of women writers who moved the novel along towards the novels of the Romantic period, and who very much moved the novel from the sentimental novel written in letter form to the novel written in chapters with a much more complex literary design. So somebody who's ready to talk about that now, if I can just pass the torch to Marie-Emmanuelle Plagnol, who is Professor of French Literature at Paris-Créteil. She's not only Professor of French Literature, she's the Director of the Doctoral Research School, and she has worked on Madame de Genlis right the way through her career in various forms. She first published Madame de Genlis at le Théâtre de l'Éducation au XVIIIe siècle, and she wrote her thesis on Madame de Genlis as well. So her work ranges across the wider period, including a study of Madame de Maintenon and the women of Louis XIV's reign. She's recently edited a wonderful collection called Les Femmes de Lumière with Huguette Crieff and other colleagues. And she has worked tirelessly throughout her career to overcome some of the prejudice towards these women writers in this period. And her early work was entitled Réécriture. And I think it's significant that when Pierre Sernard wanted to create a panel, he was talking about Réécriture. So it just goes to show that many of these ideas are taken up and run with, and it takes a little bit of time for them to filter through. But it's a very great pleasure to have Marie-Emmanuelle on this panel, and she's going to talk about Madame de Genlis.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So thank you very much. I'm very glad to be with you, but I will apologize that I will speak in French. It will be easier for me. Donc, Madame de Genlis est bien connue et je voudrais juste insister sur quelques points peut-être particuliers de sa situation au regard de l'immigration. Elle entre en effet en écriture, vous le savez, par une écriture aristocratique, puis par une écriture éducative, pédagogique, dans un cadre mi-familial, mi-princier, puisqu'elle est le gouverneur, avec ce titre original et féministe, gouverneur donc des enfants, filles et garçons du duc et de la duchesse d'Orléans, et elle se caractérise, et c'est ça qui évidemment la différencie d'un certain nombre d'autres émigrés, elle se caractérise par des prises de position politiques en faveur de la Révolution française, du moins de la Révolution française dans ses premiers mois, voire ses premières années. Et ces prises de position se manifestent à la fois par des actes et par des écrits, notamment un certain nombre de discours. Si bien que sa situation d'émigrée, lorsqu'elle part avec Adélaïde d'Orléans, est tout à fait particulière. Elle n'émigre pas seule, elle n'émigre pas en famille, même si elle va retrouver occasionnellement des membres de sa famille, et elle ne recrée pas un milieu aristocratique émigré dans les différents pays où elle séjourne, alors qu'elle est ballottée de pays en pays au gré de périples tout à fait picaresques qu'elle retrace notamment dans le livre 4 des mémoires publiés en 1825. Et ce qui est évidemment tout à fait original vis-à-vis d'un certain nombre d'autres émigrés, et ce sur quoi elle insiste d'ailleurs dans les mémoires dans des visées politiques, c'est qu'elle est relativement mal acceptée des différents cercles émigrés qu'elle rencontre au cours de ses pérégrinations, puisqu'elle est flanquée d'Adélaïde d'Orléans, qui est la fille du cousin régicide. En même temps, ce qui est extrêmement intéressant, c'est que lorsqu'on lit de près le livre 4 des mémoires, ce que j'ai refait pour un article qui m'a été demandé par Kirsty, et je l'en remercie à cette occasion, c'est qu'elle rencontre au cours de ces différents déplacements d'émigration toutes les problématiques évidemment de l'ensemble de ces femmes immigrées, c'est-à-dire qu'elle perd son identité, elle est obligée d'adopter d'autres identités, elle est reconnue, identifiée, mal reconnue, donc il y a tout un système d'identité flottante extrêmement traumatisante. Elle est évidemment en proie à de constants déplacements, avec quelques pauses parfois plus ou moins heureuses, plus ou moins bucoliques, où elle se plaît à rêver d'autres vies. Elle est aidée par d'anciens d'anciens et nouveaux réseaux qui se constituent ou qui se détruisent autour d'elle, et les mémoires apparaissent vraiment comme le témoignage de la perte par le deuil, par les départs, mais aussi la perte d'objets, la perte de valeurs que tente de compenser l'emploi du temps et l'écriture. Car en effet, évidemment, elle écrit durant l'émigration un certain nombre de textes, des poèmes, elle commence à composer son volume de fables, évidemment des romans historiques et aussi des textes tout simplement pour survivre. Et là aussi, évidemment, il y a quelque chose de tout à fait intéressant dans ce retour à l'écriture qui va faire d'elle, avant qu'elle ne puisse rentrer en France et encore plus tard toucher la pension accordée par Napoléon Bonaparte, une femme qui vit de sa plume. Donc à ce titre, effectivement, l'émigration constitue une expérience tout à fait nouvelle pour elle, tout à fait importante, qui la rapproche d'un certain nombre d'autres femmes, même si, et j'ai essayé d'insister dans cette courte présentation, politiquement et idéologiquement, elle se distingue de la plupart d'entre elles. Et ce sont ces différents traits qu'elle essaie de concilier dans un certain nombre de textes qu'elle compose durant cette période, notamment le célèbre roman épistolaire des petits émigrés, qui est une véritable œuvre éducative à travers le personnage d'enfants immigrés pour lesquels la Révolution constitue une école assez violente d'éducation. Et finalement, les deux héros, Adélaïde et Édouard, sont les petits Adèle et Théodore, mais plongés dans un univers bien réel, bien violent, loin du château finalement protecteur dans lequel Madame d'Allemagne les éduquait. Voilà.
Merci bien, Marie-Emmanuelle. I'm now going to introduce us to our next speaker, Stacey Allen, who is a specialist in French literature and culture, primarily early 19th century novels and women's writing. Her research centres on the impact of intercultural encounters on individual subjectivity in literary production. Stacey's first monograph, Writing the Self, Writing the Nation, was published by Peter Lang in 2019, and her articles have appeared in Cahiers Staël and 19. She has two forthcoming articles on Claire de Duras's fascination with Louis XIV and reader and press responses to Duras's Édouard. Stacey received her PhD from the University of Bristol in 2017 and has previously taught French literature and culture at the universities of Bristol and Westminster and done some great work on the Translations in Schools project that runs in the UK. Stacey.
Thank you very much, Kate. So it's often reported that as Claire de Duras boarded a ship bound for Philadelphia, she heard the news of her father's death by guillotine from a town crier. That moment represents several instances of uprooting for Duras, physically from the land of her birth and psychologically from identifying with France, from the social status that she had previously enjoyed, and from her paternal family lineage. Before returning to France, Duras would spend time in the New World, Switzerland, and England, where she married and gave birth to her two children. As Duras came of age, her personal history significantly diverged from that of France. My interest in Duras as an émigré lies in how this context, at once highly political and personal, shaped what she wrote and how she engaged in politics. Duras was born in 1777 into an ancient yet poor aristocratic family from Brittany on one side and Martinican wealth on the other. Her father, Armand de Kersant, published a pamphlet, Le Bon Sens, in 1788, which attacked traditional privileges. He was later elected to the Legislative Assembly and the Convention, and then guillotined for having voted against the death penalty for the king. In 1794, Duras emigrated with her mother and, after recovering assets from Martinique, settled in England. There she met and married the future Duc de Duras, who would assume the role of premier gentilhomme de la Chambre upon his father's death. Following their marriage, Claire's father, Kersant's political past would pose a barrier to Claire being presented to the king initially. After several channel crossings, including a trip by herself in around 1800 with her young daughter to recover some of her father's assets and other trips she made around Europe. The family returned definitively to France in 1808 and waited out the rest of the empire at a chateau outside Tours. Under the Restoration, Duras held one of the most illustrious salons, welcoming guests of all political hues, men and women of science and literature. At the encouragement of others, she took up writing and produced a small yet diverse corpus of works, the most famous of which is Oureka from 1823. And this is the story of a Black woman raised in aristocratic society and left without a place. The image of Duras I want to leave you with for now is of a cosmopolitan and learned woman who spent a significant amount of time living or travelling abroad, who had a liberal father and a royalist husband, who held an international and politically mixed salon, and who wrote novels that elevated socially isolated characters. And these characters challenged fixed concepts of gender, race, class, and nationality. And in that way, she's a figure who can help us reflect upon the relationship between the two terms in the panel's title, counter-revolution and emigration. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacey. It's last but not least, back to Kate, who it's my privilege to introduce. Kate is, I'm sure, well known to you all, but she's Professor of French Studies at the University of Warwick. She's also the head of the Modern Languages and Cultures School. She's got a long history of focus on the theatre of the Napoleonic period, and she led a very innovative AIHC-funded project on French theatre in the Napoleonic era between the 2013 and 2017. Her more current work produced a wonderful book that incorporated ideas about melodrama in the 100 Days, Napoleon was 100 Days in the Politics of Legitimacy, that she edited with Mark Phillip in 2018. But her focus has been drawn always to this intersection of trauma and revolution and the Napoleonic period and its emigres, and particularly women who experienced it. So she's also written this into her narrative responses to the trauma of revolution that she published with Legenda in 2012. Interestingly too, she's taught and supervised theses on most of the women in this panel. So it's lovely to be able to hand over to her for the last panel presentation.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. You may be wondering why a British woman writer is included in this salon. I'm going to give you 3 reasons for this. Firstly, because Charlotte Smith writes about emigration and has personal contact with émigrés. Frances Burney D'Arblay would be another example of a British woman writer who would fit under the title of Woman Writers, Emigration and Counter-Revolutionary Feminism. But I've gone for Smith because her émigré fiction is among a first wave of such novels, whereas Frances Burney only publishes The Wanderer in 1814. Secondly, Smith's works are translated into French and inform popular consciousness of emigration in the French-speaking world. In fact, she's one of the most important novelists in France during the revolutionary decade, as she was translated and reviewed extensively, filling the gap in the French literary scene. Thirdly, she allows us to think about the representation of emigration and about the role of women writers from a cross-cultural, pan-European perspective, and allows us to think about how texts and ideas cross borders in the period between 1789 and 1820, so offering us an interesting counterpoint to the French-speaking women we've just been hearing about. I'll give you a quick biographical sketch. She was born in 1749 to a distinguished country gentleman, but married off at 15 to get her out from under the feet of her new stepmother. She married a man called Benjamin Smith, whose father was a merchant, and she had 10 children, but her husband was a profligate, and legal wrangling about her father-in-law's will lasted for decades. In 1784, she published her elegiac sonnets, which did much to restore the poetic form to favour. After a spell in France on her husband's release from debtor's prison, a stage she refers to as her involuntary exile, she started translating from the French, but only started publishing her own prose work after she had separated from her husband in 1785. Between 1788 and 1800, she lived by her pen, producing 11 novels in which she explored social and political injustice and regularly made reference to the difficulties of being a woman writer. Over the last 10 to 15 years, British scholars have succeeded in muscling her into the British Romantic canon, where she now sits as a key figure in 1790s Romanticism as both poet and novelist. Her renewal of the sentimental tradition drew on trends of the time, such as the Gothic, but she was also heavily influenced by the French Revolution and can be seen to belong to the group of writers known as the English Jacobins, centred around William Godwin, writers who espoused the principles of 1789, liberty, equality and fraternity, and who wanted political reform in their own country. Charlotte Smith's epistolary novel Desmond in 1792 is the most striking example of her politicising of literature. The novel serves as an attack on Edmund Burke's refutation of the revolution in France and represents a defence of the principles of 1789. But as the revolution became more radical, Smith had to temper her enthusiasm. In her poem The Emigrants in 1793, she tried to suggest that the notion of freedom had been misapplied in France. Nevertheless, she hoped to move readers to sympathy for those despondent émigrés forced to leave their homes. She made poor wandering wretches the focus of her novel The Banished Man in 1794. The dispersal of émigrés across Europe had led to a burgeoning subgenre of the sentimental novel, we would consider to be the émigré novel. The Banished Man is one of the earliest. Set in 1792-93, the death of the king acts as a fulcrum for the narrative. Smith's literary work reminds us of the extent to which ideas and people circulated in the revolutionary decade and the early years of the 19th century. As a writer of liberal sympathies, she's praised and translated quickly into French. Her daughter marries an émigré, giving her personal connections to the experiences of those forced to leave France. It was, after all, a time when writers were having to reassess notions of verisimilitude, given that the daily events of the revolution were often stranger than fiction. Émigré fiction draws attention to points where the personal and the political, the family and the state intersect, and she's able to draw on personal experience to bring fiction to life. The dispersal of émigrés provided a common series of plot devices through which writers could explore notions of identity and the interplay of politics and sensibility. Émigrés drew on personal experiences for their own novels about emigration, but other writers, such as Charlotte Smith, also used emigration in their work. Interaction, adaptation, translation, and illustration across nations and languages all contributed to the development of the émigré novel as a genre. It is doubly politicised since plots are firmly tied to the political events of the revolution and authors' own political standpoints. Charlotte Smith is at the forefront of a literary vogue that would sweep Europe. Her novels reflected the uncertainties and challenges of the momentous period in which she was writing, and they were an important vehicle that allowed her to comment on politics in the public sphere, but also on the position of women. We're about to move into the question and answer session now, and there are two methods by which you may submit a question. You may submit a question to the host, listed as H. France, in the chat window. If you're willing to come on screen to ask your question, you may send a message in the chat window to the host indicating that you have a question to ask on screen. After a brief identity check, the host will alert the moderator, that's Kirsty, and at an appropriate moment, the host will invite you to activate your video and audio. In order to give you a chance to type your questions and have your requests to come on screen vetted, I am going to exploit the fact that I'm talking last to ask the first question to my colleagues on the panel. Charlotte Smith is obviously the outsider of the group of women, of the women that we've talked about, because she experienced the revolution from the outside. But she did endure what she considered to be an enforced exile, a period of time she spent in France after her wayward husband was released from prison. And it was during that time that she began to write and translate, cut her teeth as a novelist. Exile and a different linguistic context seemed to have acted as a catalyst for her literary career. And this seems to be something that applies to the other writers that we're focusing on. So I just wondered if anyone would like to comment on the role of emigration in the creative process as catalyst for a renewal of literary trends in the early 19th century.
I think I can just add into that too, as we're thinking about it. Not only exile, but also as their literature as a future or a horizon for liberty, because it's often it's the case that at the end of these novels, there is a kind of projection forward into some future time when they will have achieved liberty. So they've come out of their exile.
I think Madame de Staël was inspired by Germany to write de l'Allemagne and traveling in Germany. And she was helped by two émigrés, Charles de Villiers and the Prince de Ligne. But I think probably wherever she went, and she went almost everywhere, Vienna, St. Petersburg, London, and so on, she was probably speaking French, because French was so widely understood. Maybe in London she spoke some English. And she was certainly inspired by English and German literature.
Mm-hmm.
I think in terms of Duras as well, it's very much that taking the inspirations from the places that she visited, in particular England. She draws heavily on English literature, on the ideas of English literature, and uses talks about England as a representation of these ideas that she finds in literature. But I think that what's really interesting in Duras's case, and Kate mentioned not choosing Charlotte Smith over Frances Burney because of when she started writing. Duras herself doesn't actually start writing until the 1820s, which is 15 years after that kind of, I was going to say final return, but she also sort of is exiled to Belgium during the 100 Days. But it's almost 30 years after that initial departure from France. But the experience of the emigration is very, very central to her novels. In Memoirs de Sophie, which is an emigration narrative, she talks about how emigration deprives of a country, but also throws people into social isolation. And that theme of socialization runs through all of her novels and is used as a way of talking about who is included in society, who is included in various identities as well.
So the two memoirists that I look at for this particular study, the Marquise de L'Age de Volud and then the Marquise de La Tour de Pin, neither would have written anything if they hadn't been emigres. I mean, they wrote in response to that, neither wrote anything other than their memoirs. But I think that both of them had a message to convey. I mean, they both wrote because they wanted to say something. I mean, the L'Age de Volud because she wanted she was an unrepentant royalist and sort of wanted to go back to the Ancien Regime. And then, of course, famously, the Marquise de la Tour de Pin, she wanted to sort of demonstrate what the failure of the nobility was under the old regime and how it was because of the fact that they had played around with the sort of the louche ideas of the Ancien Regime, that they had failed and that revolution had come, and that she was sort of charting a new way forward for women. And so in their discussions of Trésia, which is what I'm focusing on, they very much sort of set themselves in opposition to her, and the way that they discuss their relationship with her is very complicated in some interesting ways because of that. So.
With regard to Madame Cottin, she's fascinated by the idea of exile and picks it up as a theme in her later novels. So she's particularly interested in a story that she finds in the newspaper about a young girl whose family has been exiled from Poland to Siberia. And the young girl's journey from Siberia to Moscow to get the emperor's permission or pardon for her father so that they can return home. She doesn't write particularly about her own experience as an émigré, even particularly in her correspondence, actually, but she does choose to set one of her novels in Britain shortly after she's returned from Britain. So there is certainly some interaction with the British literature that she's been reading while she's been there, and the places that she's been visiting, certainly.
We've got a question coming in from Sydney. I wonder if Sydney wants to come on screen and ask her question, Dave. Okay, I'll ask it for her. To what extent do these women consider citizenship essential to their fictional and autobiographical writing? Lovely question. Thank you, Sydney. Ideas of citizenship.
I think citizenship. My instinctive response to that is that actually citizenship is not something that they are especially concerned with because they lie outside of active citizenship by default of being women. I think that they're much more concerned about attacking notions of patriarchy than they are necessarily about showing citizenship as such. that's my gut instinct reaction, is that citizenship is not the first thing that they're writing about in their work.
But if you use citizenship to mean nationality, then Madame de Staël is very, very interested, and she's playing several cards at the same time. To some correspondence, she writes, "Oh, I have a truly French heart." And in reality, she's in England, sort of hoping for the fall of Napoleon. And indeed, at one point, she says, "Oh, the French are unworthy of liberty." So she's always changing in her attitudes. And her last letter is to an émigré, the Comte de Blacas, who had spent 25 years outside France. So she does have a double vision, cosmopolitan and French national, which in my opinion is a compensation for the fact that she was Swiss, married to a Swede.
Okay, and we've got a question from Carla Hess. Could any of the panelists comment on the implied imagined readers of these women writers?
I think what's interesting is, particularly in Duchas's case, at first they weren't imagined readers. All the books, all the novels she writes were initially read aloud. So the initial audience was her salon audience. She would read the drafts of her books in the salon. And it's actually she was retelling a story in the salon and then encouraged to write it down. And I think so initially she knew the audience she was writing for, and then her books get published. She's initially quite, she doesn't want to publish them. She doesn't want that public persona as an author. And I think one of the interesting things is the subjects of her books for her position in society. They're talking about, particularly Edouard, which talks about class, whereas she has a position in society which is underpinned very much by class and by class structures. So there is a tension there. So she initially has an audience she knows, and then it goes beyond, which she isn't at first comfortable with.
Okay, do you want to add something to that?
I was busy thinking about Madame de Staël. Actually, I'm not sure I'm allowed to talk about Madame de Staël because that's not my woman in this salon. But I was just thinking of her of the prefaces, the prefaces to the preface to Delphine in particular, where there's this sort of nod towards the happy few who will actually understand the message that she's trying to put across in criticizing Napoleon. So I think that the writers do have a sense of who it is they're actually trying to write for, but that's very much all of them couched in an aristocratic milieu. Charlotte Smith would be a gentlewoman. I mean, the equations between Britain and France don't work exactly, but there is a sense of an elite readership still, that we're not quite at that crossover into a general public yet, but they're very much writing for people like themselves.
Okay, we've got a question from Ronan.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for bringing me on screen. First of all, I have to say and make my comment, this is easily probably the best panel I've ever been to, or one of the best, certainly. Very focused, very dynamic, very energetic. All panels in all conferences should be like this from now on. That's what I think. I'm going to use it as a model and advocate for it. Two quick questions. One is, it occurs to me that emigration occasions a lot of anxiety, but also possibly excitement and enthusiasm, because it suspends the normal, the quotidian. I think that's true also for our period, by the way. So I wonder if you see that aspect of it also in the writings of these women, new ways of seeing things, new opportunities open up. That's one question. The second question, sorry to quote myself, but in my book I wrote something like that the violence of the terror was very much, was mostly a masculine affair. Men were doing it, and most of the victims were men, but dealing with its legacies, at least in my archival record, was very much the domain of women. dealing with the after effects of this of revolutionary violence. And I wonder if you see that in the writings or the experience of these women. Thank you very much. I'll mute myself now.
I can actually respond to that first, because you very much in the memoirs of both L'Âge de Volute and La Tour du Pin, the sort of excitement and the intricacies of their stays in Bordeaux that they narrate in great detail and the great drama of what they're going through. I mean, I have to imagine that part of why they are writing about this is to share the excitement of their lives. And I think L'Âge de Volute in particular spends most of her life going back and forth in and out of exile. And there is a lot of drama in her life. So you certainly see that as part of their narrative. I think also in terms of, you know, sort of building on what you've written about the afterlife of the terror and you know, the sort of the memories that are created afterwards under the directory, that you see that in all three of these women, because Theresa very much is trying to sort of create the mythology of the role that she played. And then these two women also in their tales of it sort of also build on creating those kinds of memories. And so certainly you see it here in Feminine Hands. The men are sort of, they're present, but they are certainly not central to these tales at all. It's the relationships between women, at least the parts of their narratives that I'm focusing on here. And so.
And Madame de Staël was clearly excited. She had a wonderful description, leaving Bavaria for Austria and 10 années d'exil. Was she going to be stopped by Napoleon's police and so on? It's a great escape narrative, and she's clearly stimulated by London and St. Petersburg. And to go back to the readership question, I think a lot of these women, well, they had publishers' contracts. They wanted to earn money. They wanted the largest readership possible. And I hope one day somebody can find these contracts and make a comparative study who did well. And Madame de Staël obviously was very famous, sold very well. And when she's in London in 1813, she drops her émigré publisher, Dulot, and she leaps into the arms of John Murray, who is a really successful professional English publisher. And I imagine she does that because she gets a better deal. And I wonder how Madame de Genlis negotiated her contracts, for example.
Alors, on a peu d'éléments sur les contrats, en tout cas dans les mémoires, elle l'était, mais c'est vrai qu'elle parle argent dans le livre 4 des mémoires, et elle entend évidemment survivre grâce à ses publications.
Oui, merci.
Et la question à laquelle je voulais répondre sur la stimulation, je crois qu'il y a un double effet. Il y a effectivement une sorte d'excitation qui se reflète dans les récits rétrospectifs des mémoires et dans les œuvres écrites à ce moment-là, qui alternent avec des moments au contraire de retraite, de calme et de pause. Et le récit des errances chez les émigrés, et notamment chez Madame de Genlis, est une alternance effectivement de fuite, de moments violents et de moments, oui, de retraite et de réflexion sur les événements. Et il faut bien voir aussi que les événements violents de la terreur sont connus avec retard. Il y a aussi cet effet de retard dont on ne prend pas toujours, nous, conscience, évidemment, dans la façon dont les nouvelles arrivent.
That brings us rather nicely into our next question, which is from Ali Boulard. She's saying she works in the 20th century. So my question is, when trauma is discussed in relation to these themes in women's novels, does it appear with the same markers as the 20th and 21st century trauma? Or can you discuss the sort of the particularities of the trauma experience? And if we can link that into this conversation of just how long it took some of these women to process what happened and write about it, because I think you can see it on this panel too, that the women who wrote closest to the time were often, you know, the women who had the most recall from the events. So there is definitely an interplay, and I don't have the complete answer to it, but there's an interplay of the sort of the décalage, if you want to look at it that way, between the actual events and the time it takes them to process them through in their writing. And we hear around us very much at the moment, you know, talk about healing, talk about forgiveness, talk about, you know, the sort of the healing processes, the collectivity. you know, how much that sort of feeds in. And I think that Ali's question is really pertinent, because, you know, we're seeing some of these very volatile political events around us, and how does that sort of reflect a little bit this atmosphere during the revolution? I'll just read that question again. So my question is, when trauma is discussed in relation to themes in these women's novels, does it appear with the same markers as 20th and 21st century trauma?
I'll jump in, shall I? Obviously, they don't have the vocabulary of psychoanalysis that we might have for talking about 20th century trauma. But I think that we can see some of the stages of coming to terms with the traumatic event. And part of that is that sort of delayed process. I don't think it's any coincidence that writers like Isabelle de Charrière in Switzerland, Charlotte Smith in Britain, are writing émigré novels before French women who are actually émigrés themselves start writing about the experience. It's very much something that happens around the edges of France to start with. So I think that there is, you can follow, I mean, Marie-Emmanuelle has just been talking about this sort of alternation of sort of retreat and then excitation, and that sort of varying between the two, often in the same chapters, is something that I think we see quite a lot in most of the women's writing. So I think it doesn't map beautifully and perfectly. You can go away and read my book, she says, shameless plug, and see if you make up your own mind as to whether it works for the early 19th century and the late 18th as well as the 20th. But I think there's enough there, if you sort of strip away the fact that they haven't got the vocabulary necessary to explain the notion of trauma. I think that we can see that they are experiencing it.
I think
well, Denise Davidson's got a question there that feeds into that really well too. Did trauma and suffering inspire these writers to explore the suffering of others and to encourage empathy among readers in the process? So how much were these novels encouraging empathy among their readers, for each other? Certainly you can see with the mention of Adèle de Senange in Isabelle de Charrière's novel, that this was the case, that this was soliciting an empathetic reaction.
Definitely Duras, and certainly the way a lot of her novels are structured. And for example, Olivier Le Secret, you have a protagonist who it is suggested he is impotent, and you get this drawing the reader in through the letters. And you get the references like, you know, listen to what happened today. Do you not think this is strange? So it's really drawing the reader in terms of how it is written, and looking at the letters that Duras received from people she'd sent the novel to, and looking at also the her novels Edouard, and looking at how the press described the reaction to Edouard, you do get that sort of overlap of emotions, the sharing of emotions, and there is a lot of references to, you know, how these novels evoke very strong emotions through the reading experience. And I think a lot of that comes from the shared experience of the revolution and the kind of wider revolutionary period of being a very turbulent time.
Certainly that idea of evoking emotions comes through in a lot of Cotin's novels and correspondence as well. She, a lot of her correspondence reveals how eager she is for her friends and family to approve of what she's written, and to appeal to some extent to her fellow women writers as well. I mean, she calls Malvina the correction of her first novel, Claire d'Albe, when she realizes just how much it was disapproved of, particularly by Madame de Genlis, actually. And one of the other things that she does to sort of evoke emotions within her readership is to appeal to a particular set of readers. So she has specific intertextual references and then hints throughout the novel that you will only understand what this character is going through if you understand these intertextual references. So she does very definitely play with a particular readership. Yeah.
You know, so thinking about the trauma of exile and how they deal with that, I wonder if too the fact that for most of them, emigration and exile is a process that continues for a really long time. They go back and forth, like they leave during, early on, then they come back, and then they have to escape during the terror, and they come back, and they have to go again maybe after Fructito. So they never get to settle in. I mean, or come back and sort of process it. It's a long ongoing event, and I wonder how that tracks with the experience of exile today or emigration today in some cases, this sort of inability to ever sort of settle and recover. So
interesting. We've got a question here too from Tommy Barr. Now, Tommy Barr, if I can just introduce him, is our artist in the conference. So Tommy is asking, what interests me is what level of traction of profile were they able to achieve in the literary circles of those countries where they were immigrants and perhaps outsiders. How long have you got, Tommy? I would like to sort of just this is one of the key, I think, questions, and we were alluding to it there, where you have the going in and out of other countries. So it links sort of to the cosmopolitanism that they were coming across. It also links to the fact that there were countries where immigrants weren't wanted, and cities where they met with, we don't want immigrants here signs at the edges of the towns. So
Madame Bessard had no problem, particularly in London. She was already well known. People talk about her as cette femme illustre, and she has a younger Swiss lover with her, but she's still accepted everywhere. And her book, when de l'Allemagne is published in French in London, it sells out almost immediately. It's a huge success. And she was already very cosmopolitan before the revolution, being from a Swiss father with a Swedish husband, and she had the rank of ambassadress, which helped open doors also across Europe.
We've got a question from Michael too, coming back to saying thank you for a wonderful panel. Are you going to come on screen and ask it, Michael? I'm not sure. Thank you for a wonderful panel. My question deals with the literary representation of trauma. Is there an awareness of bias or of the impossibility of acutely representing revolutionary events in some of these authors? Do they address the dichotomy between representing lived trauma versus observing socio-political upheaval from a distance? I think that's a very perceptive question, and I think one of
it's a very interesting question. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about the émigré novel as a genre is the way in which, and perhaps not just women writers, I'm thinking of male writers like Senac de Mailan as well, the use of actual political events to symbolize the emotional state of the characters. So in Charlotte Smith, we have the moments that the émigré hero, who's very much presented as a good émigré, there's very clearly, there are bad émigrés who make no attempt to fit into the surroundings where they've moved, and the good émigrés who at least try and recognize their hosts. The good émigré hero is prompted to go back to France by the death of the king. Similarly, in other novels, émigré novels, you find other political events are used as markers in the text of things that are happening to the characters. So you've got that mixing of the political and the sentimental that gives the émigré novel such a novel twist on the impossible situations that sentimental heroes and heroines find themselves.
Je rejoindrai effectivement ce que Kate a dit à propos des personnages mis en scène dans Les Petits émigrés de Madame de Genlis, où finalement elle définit sa position politique, et là c'est une position politique contemporaine, pas écrites de manière rétrospective comme dans les mémoires, à travers des figures effectivement d'aristocrates différents. Et les bons émigrés aristocrates qu'évoque Kate, ce sont ceux qui appartiennent à une aristocratie éclairée, celle finalement qui incarne l'esprit de 1789 et non pas celle qui reste attachée à ses préjugés et à ses traditions. Donc il y a effectivement une typologie des émigrés là dans un roman épistolaire et que l'on voit apparaître incarné dans les personnages que rencontrent les jeunes héros.
I think that's a very important point. We've got a question from Jan Matlock, who's going to come on screen and ask it. Have we got it, Dave? Okay, just carrying on that, I think that idea of the right sort of aristocrat and the wrong sort of aristocrat, and that the monolithic ways we've approached these terms has to be broken down in the next wave of immigration. Jan's on screen, so over to you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I seem to have some feedback. I don't know whether it's my internet connection that was the problem just then. So if there's a problem on your end, please let me know. Thank you so much. Of course, I'm so glad to be here. It was a fascinating panel. I was wondering if I could engage all of you to think a little bit more about how in the post-revolutionary moment, really from 1794 or 5, from the publication of most of these texts that you've talked about, upwards into the July monarchy, how these women writers rethink what the novel that was called Le Roman Sentimental, which most scholars today don't call the sentimental novel, but the novel of senses, or the novel of feeling. There's a shift away from using the trivialization of sentimental, which doesn't really mean the same thing in English as it would have in French, as you know. I'm interested especially in the way in which the novel, after the revolution, rethinks what has, from the time of Julie, pointedly articulated a relationality to feeling. So in the novel, we're constantly being invited, we all know this from Julie and New Heloise, we're being invited to be part of the feelings of the characters, especially of the female character, and something is built from it, even if that character dies. But after the revolution, in many of these women writers' novels, there's not much really that comes from that feeling. That's why the question that I think Denise asked about empathy seems to me really worth pushing a bit farther, because in many cases, don't you find that there's really nothing that these women, having had all of this feeling, actually constructs, except possibly the book. What do we have because these women felt?
I think many of them are trying to earn money, that they haven't got time to worry about what they construct other than books. That writing in itself is what they are trying to construct, because for many of them it's actually a way of subsisting. Kirsty talked about Madame de Souza and how much she needed to earn money when she first arrived in London. Charlotte Smith has no income.
I didn't mean it in the sense of what do the authors construct. I mean, what are the readers invited to assume has been constructed through their relation to that fellow feeling? In the case of Claire Daud, for example, there's just a tomb. There's there's the young man she loved who isn't even identified at her funeral. In Ulrica, she falls away like a leaf in the dust. And so many of these novels, with possibly the exception of Charrière, there's not much that remains.
I think that's one of the things you've got to pick up on, though, because you've still got to remember that they're making these comments, they're leaving it open on purpose so that you can put whatever interpretation you want to read into that ending. And I mean, also when you think about it, what concrete outcome do you want in a time when they didn't, they weren't able to be deputies, they weren't able to have political rights, and in some ways, in that context, Madame de Souza was famous for saying, well, take what you like out of it. It's just a little bit of trifling, and it's about ordinary life. And she this is where, her famous comment where she was so proud that Madame de Genlis said she never wrote anything against religion or against morals. And of course, she poked holes and skeptically, attacked them. But, they had to veil their comments. I mean, they couldn't, they weren't direct like men were direct. And it's exactly this that makes it interesting for those of us who explore the novel to just unpick this. It's a little bit like sleuthing, because they knew they were making very direct comments, but they were hiding them under a veil of a novel so that they weren't going to be shamed for doing that. So that you've really got to put that in the context of the time.
I think death often, a lot of Madame Cotton's heroines die, if not, no, not quite all, but most of them do. And death becomes this escape from a completely untenable situation. And what we're left with at the end is the highlighting of that untenable situation, that women are very often pigeonholed into one thing or another, be it this angel of domestic virtue or the sexual object of sexual desire, and that in trying to uphold both of those things, they actually end up not able to fully commit to either of them, and death or suicide even becomes a means of highlighting that untenable situation and escaping from it.
And I think I'd add to that, in the case of Duras, all of the protagonists that she has in her finished novels die at the end, but due to an untenable situation. But what she's done in the course of that novel is a lot of questioning. What is this person's place in society? How do they fit in? And it's a very, I guess, a sort of theoretical exploration of there's quite revolutionary ideas of equality and how do people fit in societies. And she has characters who don't fit, and she's asking, well, can they fit? What would be their place? And although it doesn't feel like anything solid comes out of it, but I think that's the best you could have from her situation.
And just the fact that it's reaching forward to a time when women are going to have these rights, when they're not going to have to struggle and deal with these traumas. Christine? Yeah,
there's sort of an interesting quote from L'Âge de Beaulieu that she quotes Therese saying to her. She says, "You women of feeling and grand principles, you have a very bad opinion of me. But I hold, and I will prove to anyone, that I have done much more good than you will do for many months, than you will do for many months, because I have not slept without having saved someone's life, while you, with your royalism and all your romantic sentiments, I beg you to tell me, how have you been useful?"
So that's a great line.
Concrete action that some women take is, she would argue, is perhaps more relevant than having these sentiments that they're going to write about later. And L'Âge de Beaulieu sort of leaves that comment in her memoirs without any analysis of it at all. It just sort of lingers there. So
that's a great line.
I'm a little bit conscious of time. If anybody needs to go, I'd really like to perhaps just pass it around the members of the panel if they'd like to sort of make a comment on the questions that have been asked, because I think we probably really to bring it to a close, Dave. It's nearly an hour and a half since we started. Are there any other questions from the audience that the audience would like to ask before we do that? I think we brought up some really interesting points, and it was my sort of hope that as we did the session, it was going to stimulate debate again about just how much these women created call it a movement, if you like. I've heard Rafe Blaufard use the expression a front in relation to women. And I wonder if, just as we go around at the end, we can perhaps explore this. The way we do history, it tends to have been to put these names onto groups and collectivities and to try and sort of tease out. And I think this group of novelists just brings to the fore how much women in some ways were working for each other. And they weren't particularly bothered as to whether they slotted in and out of political groupings. You know, they were all, of course, at the time slapped into this category of aristocrats, which, you know, I've spent a lot of time unpicking it and saying, well, they weren't all aristocrats, but we are always working around these monoliths. So how much were, you know, the women really didn't take them very seriously at all, and they changed their spots pretty much as they wanted to and when it suited them. Perhaps, Philip, you could talk about that with Madame de Staël.
I agree that they changed their spots when it suited them, which she did when she's promised the interest on 2 million livres, which her father had lent to Louis XVI, as she does become more pro-Bourbon. And of course, events drive convictions. The Battle of Leipzig, November 1813, she becomes noticed when Napoleon is defeated. Obviously, she's going to be more pro-Bourbon after that. And in my opinion, she downplays the trauma of the revolution, the early years of the revolution, 1789, and many assassinations in 1790 and 1791, because her father is in power, and in a way, he was the love of her life, and she's always defending his reputation. I'm impressed by how tough these women are, these terrible journeys and terrible worries and death round the corner, and somehow they float to the top again. And particularly, well, Madame de Staël was protected, as everybody said at the time, by her large fortune, but she had a very difficult situation under Napoleon and never gave in.
I think that's a very, very good point. And I mean, that seems to me one that Christine could take up on, with just, you know, how much the female émigrés were grateful to Madame Tallien. You know, that there was this sort of a link that was sort of almost imperceptible running underneath it.
Yeah, I mean, that it is really interesting how they construct their relationship with her, because they both want to distance themselves from her because they're appalled by the choices that she makes, and yet they're taking advantage of the fact that she has this liaison with somebody who's going to get them their passports and let them get out, and they like her. You know, she's apparently very, very amiable. She's very charming. She's you know, has a very good heart. And you know, the thing that always, I think too, that always strikes me is she was 20 years old. She was so young. And these women were also quite young. Nato Dupin was a few years older, and I think that L'Âge de Beaulieu was close to 30, but they're really young as they're sort of navigating these things. I mean, I think of my college students trying to manage something like this. And so they take on a sort of, you know, slightly condescending and superior attitude, but they also really like her and in the end are appreciative. And so it's sort of interesting to tease out their evaluative stance towards her. And that's sort of what I'm playing with right now. So.
I think the point about them all being 30, I mean, I've also tried to make this point too. You know, we talk about the men in the society of 30, but, you know, they were all the same age, and the women were the same age too, wanting to participate. can you say a little bit about Madame de Genlis in that context, Marie-Emmanuelle, just to finish, because she was slightly different, but she still, you know, she changed as she went through from the sort of very didactic and as she got older.
Alors oui, elle est plus âgée effectivement que les femmes qu'on vient d'évoquer, puisqu'elle est née en 1746. Elle a tout un passé derrière elle, mais effectivement, elle partage un certain nombre de traits évoqués par Philippe Mansel, hein, cette forme de courage physique et moral, cette espèce d'obstination. Et il est vrai que l'émigration radicalise sans doute en elle un certain nombre de traits qu'on a un peu tendance à occulter au début, parce qu'au retour des migrations, effectivement, elle verse dans un conservatisme politique et dans une affirmation religieuse qu'on constate effectivement très nettement, mais qui ont déjà été annoncées dès 1787 dans le livre qu'elle compose pour la communion du futur Louis-Philippe, hein, La religion comme l'unique base du bonheur, qui est déjà un ouvrage totalement contre les philosophes et qui évidemment peut s'inscrire ensuite dans sa ligne anti-révolutionnaire et anti-philosophique. Donc il y a effectivement un retournement politique, hein, mais les positions politiques de Genlis sont extrêmement complexes, hein, et évoluent effectivement au fil des années, voire des mois d'émigration et des aventures qu'elle traverse, c'est vrai.
Well, I mean, that links nicely to Stacey's. I mean, Stacey has picked up on this and said, well, you know, we're looking at this argument of nationhood.
Yeah, very, very much. I think it's very, very complex in terms of how we look at these figures, how they approach ideas of nationhood, and really question what does it mean to be French. And I think going back to that point of these being very young women at the time when they emigrate, there's a fabulous quote from Sainte-Beuve, who talks about Duras as a teenager managing plantations in Martinique. It's a bit unsure whether that happened or not, but I think these are very headstrong women. They know what they want, and I think throughout all the circumstances that they carry on and push through in whatever ways possible, and talking about changing their strives, but using whatever means necessary to publish, to engage in politics.
Absolutely. Kate, would you like the last word? Because I think we better perhaps bring this to a close.
Bring it to a close. I'm just busy scribbling things down on my piece of paper here, which says that I want to think more about the legacy of terror being the domain of women, and thinking about trauma and terror. The notion of counter-revolution versus revolution and the evolving opinions. What does counter-revolutionary actually mean? We put it in the title of the Salon, but obviously what in counter-revolutionary in 1809 means something different to counter-revolutionary in 1801. So that's something also I think that we can think about. And I've also put endings question mark on my piece of paper, because I think that we need perhaps to think again about where the women choose to end their memoirs and their novels, and what that actually says about the message that they're trying to put across.
I think also that they change their endings. I mean, this is one of the things that Madame de Souza does with Adèle de Senange. She writes a different ending in a later edition. So
as does Madame de Staël for Delphine, of course.
Yes.
So that's...
Happy endings, unhappy endings. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we better bring it to a close. So I would just like to thank everybody for a wonderful session and for participating and bringing your ideas. We've only been able to go around quickly, and it's just been an absolute pleasure to have you all and to have the different perspectives. It's really lovely to have the novelists, the emigres, and then the outsiders looking in at them. And so, I mean, I think it's really important to just look again at this nexus of literature and history as we go forward into another generation of researchers, looking at these fields and looking at the way emotion impacts on them. So look, we'll bring it to a close, but if anybody's got questions, don't hesitate to email them to any of us. And I would just like to thank again the panelists for being fabulous, and have a wonderful conference for the rest of it. This is the second live panel of the week, and there'll be 3 next week, and so just I hope that I appreciate Ronan's comment about doing it this way. We are being a little bit experimental with this conference, so please bear with us, but I hope you've enjoyed it.
Thank you, Kirsty. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Thank you.
Qui attend